Welcome to this INSEAD Knowledge video podcast interview. We're going to talk about crisis communications today. Why do companies usually fail to see the crisis coming? Mark Hunter, welcome. You're an adjunct professor of strategy at INSEAD. You're a former investigative journalist, and this has had a big influence on your research today in strategy. You've looked at a few case studies. Probably one of the most emblematic has been Danone and the boycott by consumers in France after it announced that it was going to close one of its biscuit factories. You're saying all of these types of crises are predictable, but management systematically fails to see it coming. Do you have an overarching explanation why that happens?
Well, it's not all crises, but in a certain number of crises, especially in which it's a crisis of values, a conflict with the society, there are generally signs of opposition gathering, of similar events that are taking place that indicate the scale of the opposition, of the forces in place that can react when a triggering event occurs.
In the Danone case, why do you think specifically management missed the crisis that was boiling up, and what could they have done differently?
Well, one thing is that Danone, it was the most respected company in France. This is a company that kept growing and optimizing operations throughout its history, and they never had this kind of a problem. You know, it had always been a question of management and labor relations, and suddenly they found themselves facing not just a social crisis in the French sense, where you're dealing with the unions, but a societal crisis. And no company in France, with the possible exception of Michelin a couple of years earlier, had ever been looking at anything like this. So it's not, it's not surprising, and it's not a terrible condemnation of management to say that they were overwhelmed. I think almost anybody would have been in that
Overwhelmed
situation.
but overconfident, as managers can be?
I think they underestimated the extent of the forces that were facing them. And I think they underestimated the impact of particular stakeholder groups on the outcome of the crisis. One other thing is that, when a crisis ends officially, as was the case here, it doesn't always end in the real world. There can be a really long trail to a crisis, and that long trail can be affected by the people who get involved when the crisis is white hot.
So let's just talk about numbers. What happens in a crisis like this? I mean, Danone sails through, or on the contrary, the stakeholders build up their boycott and therefore sales get hit? I mean, because obviously perhaps management is right to ignore crisis if it doesn't have an impact on the bottom line at the end of the day.
Well, in effect, there was a boycott, and one of the huge debates in France at the time was whether or not it could succeed, because a consumer boycott had never succeeded in France. Now, that raises the question, how do you define success? Okay, the boycotters said, we're going to stop Danone from closing 2 biscuit plants in France. They didn't succeed, but they did impact sales. And management was obliged, in order to discourage the movement, to minimize the effect on its sales. I mean, basically they said, our sales worldwide are up 7% in the month of April, despite a halt to all advertising in France. The storm is over. But the storm was not over. In effect, the boycott had impacted sales in France. They reduced growth in that market almost to zero. And when the financial analyst community found this out, they said, wait a minute, this storm isn't over. And they began to question management's word. And once they began to question management's word, everything that didn't please the financial analyst community became magnified. And suddenly you were looking at a long crisis, and there was an impact on the stock.
Something that's counterintuitive in your research is the idea that management spends too much time on polishing its image in the mass media and not enough time looking at alternative stakeholders, whether they be special interest groups or the financial community. You really think today companies are ignoring these populations to the benefit of mass media?
Well, when I talk to managers, okay, what concerns them is what's in the Financial Times or what's in Les Echos or Le Monde. The idea is that, we have to act on these vehicles of public opinion. But the story I've just told you was never told in the vehicles of public opinion. It was told in the reports of financial analysts. So you had this one group of stakeholders, the financial analysts who advise investors, whose interests aren't, completely coincidental with Danone's, who are saying we have a problem. And this problem was never reported in the media. So you look at the impact that this one group of people who had their own media were able to exert on the situation, and you say something has changed. Now, it's important to know something here, okay? I worked in the news media for a long time, and I studied them as well to get my doctorate, okay? And one thing I learned is, in the news media, you can tell people what's important. You can't tell them what to do about it. Stakeholder media tell people what to do about it. A financial analyst says, buy, sell, or hold. He doesn't say, in my opinion, da, 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 da. He says, do this if you want your money to be doing well. And that has a completely different impact. And these effects are not very much studied. They're emerging effects. Something has changed in the media environment with the multiplication of these new media.
You seem to suggest that the mass media can be influenced by withdrawal of advertising, whereas stakeholder media cannot.
They can be influenced by other things, okay?
Well, precisely. Let's talk about the areas of influence that management has, whether it be by withdrawing advertising or influencing stakeholders. I don't know how that's done. Perhaps you could just explain.
Well, in terms of the news media, okay, and this is something that will continue with the internet, okay, the fact that we've changed channels here isn't going to affect it because almost all the internet media are dependent on advertising. That's what Google's living on. The news media historically, whenever they get out of line, whenever they adopt an adversary position to the dominant economic or political actors in their society, come under certain kinds of pressure. One of the classic ones is advertising is cut. That happened in the US during the muckraker era. It happened in the US during the Watergate era. It's happened in France too on certain occasions. Now, Danone did not use advertising as a weapon, so far as I know, okay? But they did cut advertising and promotion in France to zero during the boycott crisis, quite naturally. And that would certainly give the media a reason to wish the boycott were over, not because Danone was threatening them, but because it's a major advertiser, and when the crisis is over, we can go back to work.
And finally, to conclude, influencing stakeholders. How can that be done by management? One area you touch on is the fact that companies have to stop seeing their communication as just sending messages out. They also have to take on messages coming in from the outside. So is dialogue the key to influencing these stakeholders, or are these a tough nut to crack?
It's certainly becoming one of the major keys. And certainly me and my colleagues Marc Le Ménestrel and Henri-Claude de Bettigny's are not the only people who are saying this. There's a whole stream of theory that's being built around these things and that's looking at the ways in which communities of people, who have voices through their own media, and different stakeholder groups who have their own media, are sending messages back, okay? It's a different paradigm from the classic marketing or institutional communication notion that you formulate your strategy, you have your objectives, you refine the message to a target, and then, you push it through and you measure the results. Okay, what's happening now is that there's a more dynamic process going on in which managers are kind of obliged to hear what's coming in from the environment as they're going along to see what other people know, how other people understand the situation, maybe what they can contribute to a solution, but certainly what they believe that will not be overturned simply because you give them a message and say everything's all right. We're seeing this more and more, not just in the corporate sector, but also in politics. People just don't believe what they're being told.
Mark Hunter, thank you very much for these insights on crisis communication.